So we'll call the meeting back to order, and I wanted to have Steve over and give us an overview of how things are going. You're new at your division or within your division.
Yeah.
And I don't always invite that guy next to you to back you up in case we got too hard on you or something. You can both sit right up the table if you want. Or,
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
And you can work between yourselves. One wants to answer, but we'd like to hear from you and your thoughts and go from there.
Well, sure. Thank you so much, Senator, for having us. Steve Collier, General Counsel for the Agency of Agriculture. What we were thinking we would do is Steve Dwinell is our expert, and he'll introduce himself in a moment about how we handle pesticide. And we understand the question to be is what happens with the pesticide drift. So if somebody is applying pesticides and it drifts onto a neighbor's property, what are the current protocols? And then I was thinking after Steve Dwinell explains that, I would talk about the right to farm nuisance implications a little bit, if you'd like me to.
Yeah, we had a gentleman from CLF in last week, and they're concerned about procedural issues and what happens, and didn't want to just let that roll through and then have a problem. So we thought we would get you in and give us ups and downs and the issues to resolve, say that. And I don't know about odor, at least for pesticides. Odors are a little different. Right?
Yeah, we don't regulate them.
You have to get us there. Legislators all blowing. Get a lot of hot
Keep those
air.
hot air balloons afloat.
Oh. Morning, Michael.
Morning.
We're going to be talking and listening a little bit about pesticide drift and issues around right to farm stuff. And so the agency is with us, and you will see us anyways, I think. So, good morning, Steve, and welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Steve Dwinell, I'm the Director of the Public Health and Agricultural Research Management Division at the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. And thank you, Senator, for the opportunity to talk about this issue. So when it comes to pesticide drift, there are two ways of regulating it. One is through our rules. We have rules that address it under our the rule for the control of pesticides. And then we also have pesticides that are applied in a way that could cause drift, have language on the label that provide directions for use on how to minimize drift. And that works with our rule, because the rule requires people to follow the label. And we also define drift in the rule, both spray drift and vapor drift, very specifically in the rule. Spray drift is the movement of pesticide dust or droplets through the air at the time of application or soon after to any site other than the area intended. That's the definition of drift. Pesticides need to be, be put where you want them, and that's it. You don't put them. They need to go to the site of application and the target of the application. And drift is something that all the regulations, the label, our enforcement efforts, the training is all geared to minimizing or preventing drift. We also define vapor drift, which means the movement of a pesticide in the form of a volatilized gas. There are some pesticide products that have volatile components, and sometimes that material will move off the site, but that's not allowed either under the our rules or the label. So if it occurs, we have the ability to investigate it and take enforcement action if we can document that it occurred. And over the last 3 years, we asked the staff to go back and look. We've had 10 cases, 10 complaints of drift over the last 10 years. 7 of them were resolved without any enforcement action, either because we couldn't document drift or the complainant actually withdrew the complaint after we explained what, the situation was. There are only 2 enforcement actions as a result of drift complaints. So it's a pretty, it's not a common occurrence.
Now, was this from a professional applicator or from a private applicator?
These were all, from looking through the cases, these were all either farms or a custom applicator. So either the farm made the application themselves, or a custom applicator made the application on behalf of the farm.
Well, that doesn't tell us a whole lot, because it could be 1 in 9, or it could be 5 in 5.
Okay, the number, I'm sorry, I didn't have that breakdown. I think the majority of these were the farmers themselves.
So sell private
Yeah,
where they get their license and spray themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
If it's done by a professional, it's much better, or it appears that way here.
Well, I mean, if it's done by a commercial applicator, they have the same liability as a person who did it themselves. I mean, they still can't allow the drift to occur, whether it's commercial applicator or the private applicator. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, but I guess I'm not catching your drift.
I think the same rule. Oh, good.
Not bad, not bad.
If the 5 of us are farmers,
Right.
was it done by one of us with our own
Yes.
license? Or was it done by a professional that we hired?
Like I said, I'm sorry I didn't break it down that way, but from my recollection from reading the cases, that of the 10, I think either 8 or 9 were the farmers themselves that made the application.
Yeah, so
And I had 1.
the professional guys that do this as a business,
Right.
it sounds to me like they might be better schooled on or something, so that the drift.
Yeah. I think it's just a situational thing. Like I said, they only have 10 complaints
Yeah, that
over
was
3 years, and there are a lot of pesticide applications made on farms.
Yeah.
So it's pretty, low incidence.
Very good. Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, that's the basics of it. But the point is, if we get a complaint, we'll investigate it. We even have we have the capability, and on 2 occasions of in the case I've read, we actually observed the application while it was being made, and we have a way to test for drift using a thing called a drift card, where you place, paper cards at certain distances, one in the field and then certain distances away. And then you pull the cards up and you analyze them for pesticide residue. So you can document, if drift occurred. And in both cases, the applicator was cooperating with our inspectors because they wanted to know that they were causing the problem. In one of the cases, the analytical results came back with no drift. And in the other case, the person who was concerned about the drift basically retracted their complaint and said, don't even bother to analyze the samples, so the samples were analyzed.
Brian?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So were there any complaints that came from the same person?
These were all unique.
They were all separate, 10 complaints,
Yeah,
separate people.
Yeah.
Does wind, I assume, have some sort of a factor
Oh,
on this?
absolutely, yeah. So the label directions specify the wind speed you can't apply over, usually it's 10 miles per hour. There are also label directions for not applying during a temperature inversion, so that you don't get the vapor drift, because in a temperature inversion, you'll get a static layer of air, and for these products that are more volatile, they can actually move off-site during a temperature inversion. So there are, and if that occurs, then we do the investigation, we'll go back and look at the weather records and document if whether the reversion was present.
And you mentioned 2 enforcements? And what sort of enforcement?
One was a notice of violation with a fine. That was paid in full. And the second was just we do graduated enforcement. We start off slow. So this one was the first offense, and so it was a letter of warning. So that means if there's a second offense, then it's a monetary fine.
And Steve, how does the spraying of pesticides fit into the RAPs?
So I think I already introduced myself. Yep.
That's our guiding thing in the right to farm, as long as participants meet all the RAPs, they're somewhat good to go. So is this part of the RAPs or not?
A requirement of the required agricultural practices is that anyone who's using pesticides needs to comply with the pesticide regulations in Title VI. So in response to your question, the RAPs incorporate following the pesticide regulations. That I believe that the language that Mr. O'Grady drafted would already incorporate that. There wouldn't be any problem with being more explicit about that if you wanted to, in your language, say follow the RAPs and also follow the Vermont pesticide regulations. To me, that would be synonymous, but it wouldn't. It would be, if you wanted to be explicit about that, it certainly could be.
Well, there's certainly more and more people that are concerned about pesticides and I know they have to be used, but they should be used in a manner not to affect the neighbors. Now, how far can this stuff drift? I mean, say, well, I don't give a damn, I'm gonna apply my pesticides today and just go do it. And even, the wind isn't that bad. How far would that?
Well, they're actually, the property line would be the simple answer.
Oh,
If it goes to if it passes the property line, that's drift. Potentially, depending on how the label is written, it could even be the field edge. So if you're applying to a cornfield, for example, and the material drifts onto a buffer strip, in a situation like that, if that buffer was still on the applicator's property, we would, if we were concerned about there being a drift problem, we would go back and look at the label language itself. And depending on how the labels are, it could potentially be the edge of the field. Because the whole idea of preventing drift is the pesticide has to go where you intend to apply it, not anywhere else. So, yeah. So potentially it could be, but the simple answer is the property line. I mean, that's clear cut.
But could it go 100 feet or 1,000 feet?
Well,
Or,
it shouldn't go, it should go 0 feet is the goal.
well, the law is, and
Yeah.
it's what we're intending, but
Right.
say if I'm a neighbor and my property line is, well, mine's a half a mile, but if that was 1,000 feet, which is big, for a home,
Right.
could it drift 1,000 feet?
Are you saying that
Or
is
the
the
pesticide?
is the property line 1,000 feet from the application site?
Yes.
Okay. Again, that gets back to where we would want to look at the situation and look at the label. If the pesticide crossed the property line, then that's drift.
Trouble.
Without a trouble, no doubt. But if it, say it drifted 500 feet toward the property line, that's where we would go back and look at the label, see what the label directions said. And if they were not in compliance with the label, it would still be a violation. For example, say an air blast sprayer in an apple orchard. Okay, if you have an air blast sprayer in an apple orchard, there are label directions that.
That's why they spray apple trees.
Right. They have the big sprayers, but there are instructions on the label that require you to turn the sprayer off at the end of the row, for example. So you don't drift off the orchard. So if we were investigating an application in an apple orchard where the air blast sprayer drifted, even if it was on the orchard property, and they hadn't turned the nozzles off as they were required to by label, that would be a label violation.
Well, wouldn't they be wasting?
And they'd be wasting product and everything else, yeah.
Right.
So what kind, did you,
I can go after you.
I'm just kind of curious, innovation, technology is always
Yeah.
changing.
Mhm, mhm.
We're talking manure injectors and all that kind of stuff. What sort of differences are there now versus 10, 15, 20 years ago in terms of applicating for a pesticide?
Massive differences.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, getting back to the example of the apple orchards and other fruit tree crops, the more sophisticated sprayers now have photosensors, so they automatically turn off
Okay.
at the end of the row. Or, for example, if you have an orchard, you have some areas where you have new trees planted, so you have a gap in the canopy, they'll turn off or reduce the rate of flow when they hit that spot. Because again, you don't want to waste the pesticide, it's expensive. And you're not getting any benefit from it if you're spraying in air. So yeah, the sprayers, the more sophisticated sprayers have that kind of technology on it, so they only apply where you want to apply it. And the same thing with rounders. They have GPS enabled applicators that you actually program exactly where you want it to apply, and it only applies in that spot.
Now, is that applied close to the ground?
Depending on the application and the crop, yeah. Yeah, so there are label directions for boom height, for example. The boom, you can't, corn and soybeans, you can't have the boom more than X feet above the canopy. So again, we're trying to reduce drift. Drift is bad for everybody. And so, the labels are written very carefully with a lot of research behind them on how to minimize drift.
Brian, you.
Oh, thanks, Mr. Chair.
I was trying to wait long enough for you to forget your.
We're probably only taking another minute. If pesticides do drift, is that considered under the new bill a trespass? Yeah, well, or maybe it's Mr. O'Grady. I don't know who it is.
Well, I think one piece, and correct me, I don't think I've heard Steve say this yet, but I think it's a fundamental piece of this, that as I understand it from Steve, if pesticides drift across property lines, that is a violation. So that's and correct me if I'm wrong about that, but that is, I think, the fundamental question for your nuisance protection act bill, because what you're trying to draw, I think, is clear lines about this whole issue. But if drift isn't, as I understand it from Steve, labels don't allow drift, our regulations don't allow drift. So if someone is using pesticides in a way that they cross property boundaries, that would be a violation of the pesticide rules. Because of that, a neighbor could also bring a nuisance and or trespass action. The question of whether it's a nuisance or trespass is unresolved by the Supreme Court. It could potentially be either. It's more, or both. It's more obviously colorable as a nuisance claim, but the Supreme Court has left, Vermont Supreme Court has left room for it to also be brought as a trespass claim, depending on the type of violation or impact, actually.
So thank you, Mass. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, Michael, you want to weigh
So
in on
here's
that?
what I'm just trying to figure out in my head. If this is considered a trespass in any way. And I heard what Mr. Collier said about the Supreme Court's it's not sort of settled yet. I guess what I was thinking is if it's considered a trespass or a nuisance, then are we again setting something up where with the new bill that the property owner would have less rights in any way to sort of, I don't know, protect themselves or get the farmer to stop in the right to farm bill? The answer just might be no, but that's kind of what I'm trying to figure out. I'm looking to Mr. O'Grady. Does that make sense?
Sure. First, I agree with Steve that the Vermont Supreme Court hasn't addressed the issue of whether drift is a trespass or a nuisance. They had that issue in front of them in 2008, but they seemed to indicate that they wouldn't consider it a trespass, but they also indicated that there were scenarios where it could be a trespass. They didn't find that it was a nuisance because there wasn't substantial injury from any presence of pesticides that crossed a boundary. So they definitely had an opportunity to address that issue, and it's a pretty interesting case in their discussion, but they never really resolved the issue of whether in that particular case it was a trespass or a nuisance. And that's because it's about the facts. And this is going to answer your second question. The facts of each scenario will be what determines whether or not there is a nuisance claim or a trespass claim and whether or not the current bill would protect. As Steve was just indicating, the bill in its current form requires compliance with the RAPs. If there's drift, there's arguably a violation of the RAPs, and there wouldn't be protection for that activity under the bill.
That's
And,
helpful.
Were you listening, Michael, when Steve suggested that we could even add pesticide drift,
Yes, I think you could
RAPs plus, or
compliance with the RAPs or compliance with the agency's pesticide rules. I think that could be added in.
yeah.
Mr. Chair, could I ask, I'm wondering again, just kind of back to last week's testimony. Who is the bill most important to right now? Is it the agency? Because I'm not hearing from my farmers. So who's really saying
I
this
only
is?
got one.
You got more than that. But it was interesting. Last week, this guy said that we could be setting up a culture, and I wrote it down, that makes it much more attractive for bigger farms to come in. And in being in this committee, it doesn't sound like that's the direction we necessarily want to move in. And then the other part that just sticks with me is the part where, again, farmer and neighbors, we want them to be balanced. We don't want to take any property rights or anything away from Vermonters. And that's the other part that I'm most worried about, and I think our colleagues would be also if we brought something to the floor that felt unbalanced or that property rights in any way were being removed from any Vermonter. So those are just my kind of two concerns. And maybe just hearing directly from, I don't know who it is that is really who's pushing for the bill, who is really saying this bill is so important, because I'd love to have that person sitting here saying, my God, this is a game changer for Vermont. This is really important. That would be helpful to me, I think.
Well, we had them here. I don't know.
Who was that?
Amanda, St. Pierre, Bill Rell.
So that's the one farm? Is that accurate? No, okay.
No, there was a host of them. Some are here, some are on
So
the screen, but we'll have them back.
It might be, yeah, I'd like to just go back, now that we have this additional info, I'd love to talk to Bill a little bit again to see what he thinks about the property rights stuff, some of the other testimony.
I think the main, what I took from them was they wanted to simplify the issue.
Okay,
Shorten it, simplify it, and wanted to have some concrete parameters that was known to everybody. What the rules were that you had to follow
yeah,
to be within the fence line.
yeah,
And that's, Michael was in on most of that, and, well, all of it, actually, O'Grady.
okay.
And, but once
Well,
we
actually, no,
get,
that's helpful, I appreciate that. yeah.
once we get to we do operate different than some communities. Once we get to
Yeah,
a place that we feel we're somewhat
more comfortable,
comfortable,
we can have them, great,
then
thank you,
we'll have them back in
yeah, and
to
respond,
see if they're still comfortable with
that'd be great.
what our additions or
Yeah.
deletions and.
No, I appreciate it, Mr. Chair. May I just ask Mr. O'Grady one more question? Because this would be helpful.
Sure.
Mike, I don't know if you can weigh in on this, but last week we did hear that it wasn't like we were in some ways removing a property right. We were taking some rights away from neighbors. And can you agree or disagree with that? Or is that did that gentleman not make an accurate statement when he said that this really is causing an unbalance out there?
I think that's a matter of perspective.
Okay,
I do know that I've referenced it before, and at least one witness last week referenced it as well, that the Iowa Supreme Court back in 2004 had ruled that the Iowa right to farm law resulted in a taking. However, the Iowa Supreme Court in 2022, May or June of 2022, reversed that decision and said, no, it is not, if the conditions for protection under the right to farm are met, meaning that the farm was there for a year in this case, prior to the complaining activity or complaining use, and that the policy decision of the legislature is to protect the use by the farm and not allow those that move to the farm or complain about the farm's activities after they've been there to basically control the use of the farm. So it's a debate, Senator Campion. There are valid points on each side, but you can look at that argument from both ways.
so I mean, you're our lawyer. We're going to hear from a bunch of other lawyers, and I recognize Mr. Sanderson isn't. So you're saying right now you wouldn't agree necessarily with that statement that
Again, I hate to keep coming back to this, but it depends on the facts. It depends on the facts of each case. Is there a scenario where a farming activity and this law would potentially really impair the use and enjoyment of a home or property, and therefore potentially rise to a level of taking away a use of that property? It's possible. It's possible. Is there a potential for, if you don't have this law and you leave the existing law in place, that a person new to Vermont or new to the area moves next to a farm and rebuts the presumption, even though the farming practice hasn't changed, by showing that there's a significant interference with their, and I'm not getting the standard right, but rebuts the presumption. Yeah, yes, and that I think is part of the anxiety of the farming community, that they think they are doing everything that they can. They're consulting with experts. They're complying with the law. They're not having enforcement actions brought against them, but somebody can move next to them, and even if they don't significantly change their activity, somebody can move next to them and say, you're creating a nuisance for my property, you have to stop. That creates significant anxiety for the farming community. But I can also see the trial attorneys and other advocates saying, well, they have significant anxiety about a loss of a remedy for the neighboring property owner.
I get it.
It's
complicated.
Well, that's why you are a senator. You get to make these complicated policy decisions.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I appreciate it.
You can go right ahead and make this, I'm all done, unless I get a pay raise.
Thank you.
Right?
Thank you, Mr.
Thanks.
Chair. Michael, is the period of time we're talking about in Iowa's law, and is it a fairly standard amount of time, the 1 year, or where did we get that 1 year?
That was from Kentucky. The 1 year is fairly common.
Okay.
Other jurisdictions have other time frames. I don't know specifically what Iowa's time frame is. I can find that out for you in the next 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, that might be something that we might be able to change, the length of time. But I like the idea of adding the pesticide to the RAPs. I don't see where, that would, if the farmer is following the rules and regs and doing it right, that shouldn't make a bit of difference, or the applicator. We could deal with that. And then are there different ways to apply these pesticides that are better than other ways, or are we using the latest and best technology to get this stuff done, get these jobs done?
Thinking about how to answer. The application methods for the products, let me back up. The products are formulated and tested using the available application technology usually.
Oh,
You know,
so
so
they're set up to use the
Right.
latest and.
Right. But there are some specialized pieces of equipment in some cases that the label will specify you've got to use this particular type of equipment
Yeah.
and this particular configuration, depending on the characteristics. And we always have the opportunity, if we determine that there's a use pattern and a piece of technology that would be better, we can always go back and require that on the
In
label.
the yard rules.
Well, not even on the rule, but in the label. We can tell the pesticide registrar, we won't register your product in Vermont until you add this to the label.
Yeah,
So that, I can't think of any particular technology that's out there right now that would, fundamentally change the issue, but, there are advances in technology and, the way things were applied, 20 years ago versus now in terms of equipment and pressure and monitoring and nozzle type and specifications of the nozzle type and all that kind of thing. So there have been advances for sure.
and has our usage of pesticides increase, decrease, stayed about the same over the last 10 years or?
Well, without looking at the actual data, just from what I've looked at so far, the types and the amounts of different pesticides have changed as the pest issues have changed, cropping patterns have changed, new products have come on the market, old products have gone off the market. So, you get a blanket statement, can't really make that. You have to look at each individual cropping system, pest issue, and pesticide type of issue.
Maybe I can ask it a different way. Have complaints increased over the last 10 years?
I've been here 10 years.
Found a way to not answer that. That's great.
But from what I understand, no.
Okay.
In fact, for these drift complaints,
Yeah.
we haven't had, these are based on the federal fiscal year. We haven't had any in this federal fiscal year so far.
Okay.
So, and as you may recall, I've, worked in Florida for a long time. We had a lot more drift complaints than that. I mean, it was,
Yeah.
it was in, getting into 100 a year kind of thing, because it's bigger, there's a lot more active. Plus there was aerial application, and aerial application tends to oftentimes cause.
What town do you live in?
So no aerial application here, so that cuts the number down.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, but we don't do aerial.
no,
No.
it just doesn't work. The fields are smaller, and, it just
I mean,
doesn't work.
we do aerial seeding,
Oh, okay.
broadcast seeding. I think there's a little of that. Guys up in Milton, is it?
I'm not certain.
I'd like to learn about that myself. Actually.
Yeah.
So, we'll get to that.
Just taking it away from farmers or anybody at this point, but you can go into any Home Depot, right, and buy some kind of herbicide, pesticide kind of thing.
Mhm.
I'm just curious, we don't really need to get into this, but do you see much, do you get those complaints also ever? Like, hey, my neighbor, you could even be living in the suburbs and
Right.
my neighbors just
Yeah.
sprayed their roses.
Drift is
and
drift.
Drift is drift, yeah.
So, I mean, none of these cases involve that in particular, but that could happen.
That could happen.
And we had a case like that in Florida.
Yeah.
You did,
Oh,
okay, yeah,
We've had
yeah.
some on that.
yeah,
Where neighbors get the scrapping over.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh, I'm sure, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Interesting.
Oh, Michael?
So I agree with Steve that drift is drift, but what you buy in the hardware store and what a farmer uses are not the same thing.
Sure.
What you're buying in the hardware stores is most likely a Class C pesticide.
Yeah.
And it can't have more than 3% active ingredient in it. Or what a farmer is using is most likely a Class B, if not a Class A, and that has more than 3% active ingredient in it. So I think my point is you're less likely to have a drift issue from what you buy from a hardware store because of the relatively inert nature of it once it's going to be dispersed.
Thanks.
So, okay. So there are other issues, within the bill, that either of you have concerns about, or we could tighten up, to, see, I wouldn't mind having the 2-year limit. I don't think we would get too many complaints on that instead of 1. 2 years. The other issue is, Michael's been working on, is a process that would allow for a mediation prior to, to try to get it figured out between the neighbor and the farmer, in a somewhat of a peaceful manner. And rather than having to fool around and spend lots of money and wait for the court system, because the main thing that I would think of is to get it resolved with the farmer neighbors so that this issue comes to a halt and it gets rectified, and you go on living your life and being friends. So I don't know, Jamie, if Scott would want to weigh in on that. I haven't even talked with any of the farmer folks about that, but and I wasn't gonna bring it up until next week, but because next week we want to try to get the bugs worked out of this so that, we'll go on being friends and friends with our neighbors without tipping the cart bottom side up and so I don't know.
Jared Carpenter, Lake Champlain Committee. Yeah, certainly we go back and talk about it. I don't want to commit one way or the other to mediation or arbitration, something that's more binding. But certainly willing to go back and discuss with Scott and back to the committee.
Well, at least it would open up a dialogue that was somewhat.
Correct.
So
It would have neighbors make sure that they talk to each other first before
or somebody in the middle talks to them.
brings them together. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we would still like the option if all else fails for
Oh,
the court system to be involved, but it would, having people sit down at a table and discuss the issue first before jumping straight to that, yes, certainly go back and discuss it.
well, I think that's, I mentioned it to Brian, I think. Earlier that I was gonna try to get Michael to work that into the bill and then present it to the. It's a talking issue, not an issue that is in stone.
Yes,
So you'll talk to your group
yes,
and, I think, Farm Bureau's here, you ought to talk to your different farmers that you folks represent.
Yeah.
And, Linda, do you have a copy of our proposed, schedule for next week there? What day we had kind of lined up for?
Michael's coming in Tuesday. To talk about rate farm.
So maybe if you have anyone that's interested in hearing Michael run through the stuff, they don't have to come, but they could Zoom in, and Linda will send them a Zoom link. And same thing, Jared, Steve wants to weigh in, or we could, did we have a separate date for that? Because we're gonna present it, then we as a committee need to work on it. And
We do have time either early
Friday,
Friday, and
yeah, so there might be a another meeting later in the week on Friday. So just give you a heads up so you can sort of plan, and same thing for you folks. And the whole idea behind this was I believe from the farmers, from what I gathered, was to get it simplified, get it direct, not to take any rights really away from anybody, but to set up guardrails, what the rules and regs would be that for sure that you had to follow. So everybody knows, you know, what the rules are. And, you know, I don't want our farmers polluting on their neighbors. And I don't want the neighbors polluting on the farmers. You know, if there's septic systems running over on the farmer's field or lawn or whatever, you know, that isn't right either. So, you know, we're trying to balance this out so that we're all Vermonters, and most usually Vermonters try to get along if they possibly can with, except for if you live in Albert. Then you go in the middle of the gym floor and settle it. But we, you know, we want to keep things fair, and from time to time you have to update laws, and this one's been quite a few years. So are there any other issues that we?
Oh, not related to this, just a new issue that, just back to if we're looking at next week's agenda, the pollinator, you guys did a lot on pollinator protections over the past
you
couple of
do
years.
that too, right?
Maybe just where that, oh, great. Sorry,
I was gonna
I
surprise
swear-
you. You're a little slow.
I guess so, man. This is probably my last day here, by the way. It's nice.
I'm used to being on a committee where the chair lays it all right. Weeks ahead of time.
Yeah, we just turned the agenda page.
I'm
over.
sorry, all right.
No, Brian,
Thanks.
we have spent a lot.
Yeah, I
of
know you-
time,
yeah,
and
thanks.
it's a real issue,
Yeah,
and
oh, geez, you're right.
I don't know if,
Thank you.
you know, we've done quite a bit to protect our pollinators. And I don't know how you judge if you're doing, if last year was better than the previous year. But we might have some national numbers, or you folks might, that you could look at and to see how those, because it has been nationwide that, the problem, and,
Yeah,
but anyways, yeah, we'll
Thanks.
get into that tomorrow.
Senator, may I add just a couple of quick points on the right to farm issue? Is that okay?
Well.
I don't blame you. Well, I heard Scott Sanderson's testimony too, and I think he's terrific. He's very articulate, very knowledgeable. I think he's persuasive. I do think that one thing for you all just to keep in mind is the proposed change doesn't take away anyone's rights at all. If you enact this law, anybody can sue anyone for nuisance or trespass. What it changes is the rules for how that's applied.
Yeah.
Any neighbor will still be able to file a nuisance action, will still be able to file a trespass action, but what would be different is both the farms and the neighbors would know what the ground rules are for that. So ideally, there'd be fewer lawsuits because the rules would be clearer. But the other piece is when we're talking about pesticide drift, just to keep in mind is these are nuisance and trespass or property law claims. These have nothing to do with personal injury. These have nothing to do with other sorts of torts that can happen because of pesticides. So if a farmer hurts somebody, the farm's dumping pesticides into somebody's well, that person drinks the water, gets sick, gets cancer, dies. That's not implicated by these property law claims. That would be a different sort of tort claim where you're talking about bodily injury. This is just, and I think if you look at the right to farm, the preamble to right to farm is talking about protecting farmers. And then if you look at the enabling legislation, it doesn't really do that because it doesn't make it clear that farming is permissible if done appropriately. So I think what we're proposing is that the legislature make those public policy choices and balance farmers' interests and neighbors' interests, and say to farms, if you are following all the rules, then you're doing it okay. If you're not, then your neighbor can challenge you. And it's not another important piece. It's not to the agency of agriculture or the legislature about whether or not the farmer's doing it correctly. If the neighbor sues, it'll be up to the court. So regardless of Steve Dwinell and his team go out and say there's drift or no drift, it doesn't matter. The neighbor can claim there's drift, can go into court, and if the neighbor can prove that there is drift and there was an impact, that neighbor can prevail. So we have a role that's complementary, that we're enforcing the administrative regulations, but the neighbor doesn't rely on us. We don't get to tell the court what to do. The neighbor can still bring their claim, said that person applied pesticide, they broke the rules, drifted onto my property, I'm gonna sue you. And then it's up to the court to decide whether that's true. So it is a clarification and a redrawing of the lines, but I'm quite confident it's not depriving anyone of any right that exists. It is trying to clarify what those rights are.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, you're certainly right. That's where, you know, I've been coming from, the farmers that I've dealt with have been coming from.
Yeah.
And so I'm glad to hear that. So anyways.
Mike has his hand up. I don't know if that's.
I think it's an old hand.
Oh, it's an old hand. Okay.
Is that an old hand or is that your new hand?
It's an old hand.
Well, thanks, guys. It was
Thank you.
nice having you with us.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you run across anything that you need to chat with us about, you know, feel free to contact us. Always glad to listen. Well, I don't know. Most of the time.
Okay, thank you very much.
So you're up here from Florida? Did you move up here from Florida? where you did this
Yes,
work?
sir.
Oh, wow. That's, yeah. It's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
I
that
don't
is nice.
blame him.
Oh, neither do I. Neither do
I
I.
tried to get my wife to go to Florida and she went and then came home and said no more of that stuff.
Yeah.
Well, we're glad you're here.